Welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility, an ongoing inquiry into American political origins and evolving institutions. The Executive Director of the Virtual Center is Dr. Bill O'Brien. He's also your host for this continuing conversation. Here he is now, Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Thank you, Bob Kincaid, and welcome to the Monday edition of the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. We have entered into the month of August. Today is the third day of August, Monday. It is a pleasure to be with you here at the Virtual Center. Once again, of course, we have not been together live since our program concluded on last Wednesday. So, and I apologize for the late start today. We got started about 12 or 13 minutes late. A little bit of technical problems on my end. I still have this feeling that if the word got out that I was headed for Silicon Valley, they would pay me an unlimited amount of money to not come. But anyway, it is a pleasure. I had to basically shut my computer down and reboot the entire system in order to get into the program. But here we are, and it is a pleasure to be with you today. I hope you are enjoying the weather where you are. I know we've had some very, very mean weather. California seems to be on fire for all practical purposes, and we have had some severe weather in the Midwest. But here in the East, we've enjoyed 4 or 5 days in a row of absolutely delightful weather. I think it's about to end. We're anticipating a little bit of rain later this evening here in Appalachia, but since the middle of the week last week, we have had absolutely astounding weather, and it's just been delightful. I want to again thank you for your willingness to give us a portion of your valuable time. More and more as we move into the 21st century, it is becoming clearer and clearer that the most valuable thing most of us have is our time. And to ask you for a significant portion of it, especially on a regular basis, is a pretty serious issue. And so I want you to know that I will do everything I can to make the time that you are able to devote to the Virtual Center as valuable as I can make it. I hope it is. I invite you to participate actively in our program. We have a phone number that has been reserved to get you on the air. Our phone number is area code 304-663-4676. 304-663-4676. My email address, if you'd like to communicate directly with me via email, I would love to hear from you, and I will do the very best I can to respond to you in kind. My email address is waobrien, O-B-R-I-E-N, 906 @gmail.com. waobrien, 906 @gmail.com. And again, I remind you that now we are, I believe, into our third week, or entering our fourth week, where we have had a Facebook page for the Virtual Center. If you type in on Facebook, the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution, you will gain access to our page. And I am trying to regularly post some issues and some things that we either have talked about or we will be talking about. I am doing everything I can do to try to alert our listeners and the followers of Facebook as to what our programs will be about. For example, early last evening, I posted a document on Facebook which was really a lead-in to our programs this week. As you know, if you were with us last time, last Wednesday, you know that we had begun to discuss Madison's Federalist Number 10. We had been into the document. If you recall, in the last 15 or 20 minutes of the program, we had a caller, and that took us right to the end of the program on Wednesday. But we were into Federalist Number 10 last Wednesday, and of course we announced at the end of the program that we would be picking up with that today. Thinking about that over the last couple of days, I tried to come up with a way that would alert our Facebook folks to our programming and what it will be about, not only today, but theoretically for the rest of the week. And so I posted a little bit of background, a little bit of context, if you will, on Facebook, because I think that's where we'll be going and what we'll be going into for the next couple of programs here at the Virtual Center. Basically, what I said in the introduction is that what we're really dealing with here, it seems to me, and again, you can focus on a number of different issues associated with all the Federalist Papers, but especially number 10. It has so many different facets to it that depending on what you choose to emphasize, you can take these serious issues in a number of different directions. But it seems to me that the more I think about it and think where we might go in our treatment of the Federalist Papers, and more specifically Federalist number 10, and I think we'll probably lead directly from that into number 51, which is a logical follow-up, it seems to me, to Federalist number 10. The issue that seems to me to cry out for attention is the issue of the nature of human nature. And what I mean is, as you think about the contemporary society we're living in, the issues of the day, as it were, there is absolutely no question that we seem to come back over and over and over again to the issue, what is human nature really all about? More specifically, how much of what we are as a species is genetic, is programmed into us at birth, and how much of what we are is derived from what we learn after we are born. In other words, how much of what we are, who we are, what we believe, what we do, how we behave, how much of that is learned, how much of that is innate or genetic, is programmed into us, is part of our DNA, as it were. It seems to me that as we deal with one issue after the other in today's complex world, we seem to keep coming back to that issue. And my point is, was on Facebook, that when you think about it, we begin to recognize that the founders also wrestled with this particular issue, with these kinds of problems. And what we are confronted with are two different approaches that seem to constantly struggle for preeminence. Conservatives in today's world are more likely to buy in to the idea that human nature is evil, to tie into the idea of human nature as elaborated upon by, among other people, Thomas Hobbes. Thomas Hobbes believed that human nature was innately evil. He bought into the idea that the religious concept, or the religious idea of original sin, forever stained the human being, forever stained man. Consequently, man could never really overcome his innate DNA, his inclination or tendency to do evil, to not do what's right, but to naturally do what's wrong. Thomas Hobbes, in his Leviathan, made the very famous argument that if man is free, if man is at liberty to do whatever he chooses to do, then the fact of the matter is the world will be a world of chaos. Thomas Hobbes argued that the state of nature as he envisioned it, the state of nature when man was totally free, when there was no government, there were no rules, there were no laws, man was totally free to do whatever he chose to do. Hobbes described the state of that state of nature as a state of perpetual warfare, where every man would be at war with every other man. And because people were totally consumed with aggression on the one hand and protecting themselves from aggression on the other, the result would be that there would be no progress. There would be nothing positive to come out of this. Life would be nothing but warfare and turmoil, distrust, hatred, people seeking to take from other people, people concentrating on keeping others from taking from you, and that would be the result. Consequently, there would be no such thing as progress, no such thing as peace. Hobbes' conclusion was that the only way that man's reason showed him a way out, the one thing that man had was reason, common sense, the ability to think. And according to Hobbes, reason pointed out the only way to escape from this kind of perpetual warfare. And the way to do it was to create government. But in order for government to successfully stop the chaos that was the state of nature, government's power had to be absolute. Government's power had to be the sum total of everybody else's power who lives within that particular political framework. Nothing, no source of power could be competitive to government's power. Because Thomas Hobbes reasoned that for every degree that the power of government is lessened, the chaos of the state of nature will return. And so that the only kind of solution to this issue would be a government of total power. Obviously, those who advocated absolute power in the hands of government, in England, for example, those who advocated the divine right of kings, the absolute power of the king over Parliament, for example, would naturally look to Thomas Hobbes for a philosophical justification for their position of absolute power in the hands of government. Obviously, those who were denied that power would seek an alternative. And as we know, John Locke is probably the most famous political philosopher of this period, who gave us a justification or a rationalization for limits on the power of government. And basically what that means is Locke qualified the chaos of Hobbes' state of nature and basically argued that man's reason, again, the emphasis on reason, man's reason told him that government was the solution to the problems within the state of nature. But Locke pointed out that the problems in the state of nature were not anywhere near as dire as Thomas Hobbes had laid out. John Locke argued that man's reason tended to dominate or to govern the state of nature. Because man had reason, Man's common sense told him that the only way that you could enjoy peace and security was if you were willing to give it to others. In other words, common sense seems to suggest what we call the golden rule. If you want to be treated with respect, then the only way you can expect that is if you treat others with respect. Locke's explanation of the state of nature then was that reason tended to dictate or to define the laws which govern the state of nature. Natural law was that behavior, or were those laws that made sense to man. So consequently, Locke's position is that the state of nature wasn't all that bad, because man's reason dominated, man's common sense told him the way that behavior had to function. The way you treat others is the way they will treat you, etc., etc. And for the most part, Locke believed that worked. But he pointed out that if there was a drawback to the state of nature, it was the fact that there was no coercion, there was no government, there was no way to enforce if somebody did violate the laws of nature, there was no force or no agency in existence to punish those who would violate the laws of nature. In other words, the only enforcement of the law was self-enforcement. The only way you could insist or demand that the laws of nature be obeyed is if you enforce them. And Locke's position is that became very inconvenient. That became a problem. So, like Hobbes, Locke reasoned that man's common sense told him that the creation of government was the logical way to relieve the pressures of the law. In other words, to restore law and order. And so consequently, man entered into a contract with government. Man's reason told him that if you create government, you had to be very, very specific on what you were creating government to do, and you had to be very specific on what power you granted to government in order to be able to carry out its functions. Consequently, Locke's position is that government needed to be limited. Government needed to be limited to the specific terms of the contract which created it. Man was creating government and giving it the power to do very specific things. Specifically, government was created to protect man's life, liberty, and property. And that was all. If government tried in any way to seize more power than the contract, the social contract, gave it, then man was entitled to overthrow that government because the government had violated the contract, and to create a new government that would abide by the terms of the social contract. So what we have here, and I didn't necessarily at the beginning of the program intend to go into this, but I think this background is very significant. What we had here then are two different philosophical approaches to the power of government. One which is designed to justify government's unlimited power, the other whose purpose is to justify government's power as being defined and limited. In other words, according to Locke, people only surrendered the degree of power to government that was necessary for government to do its job. The people retained all the rest. The people retained their freedom, their liberty. And they created government to protect it. So consequently, what we have here are two philosophical positions, if you will, which relate directly to the nature of the human being, to human nature. If you subscribe to the idea that man is innately evil, is a victim or a product of original sin, and cannot do what he should do unless he's forced to do it, then you are mandated, if you will, to create a government that has the power to bring that about. You are leaning more in the direction of Thomas Hobbes. However, if you believe that man's nature is not necessarily evil, that man's behavior is governed by reason, by common sense, you believe that reason will dictate the rules and the behavior of people in the state of nature, then your conclusion is that man is able to do what's right. That man's reason will show him the way. And so consequently, government's power need not be absolute under those circumstances. Government's power can be limited to the specific powers necessary for government to carry out the functions for which it was created. And if you translate this or transfer this into today's period, you basically are in a position where conservatives philosophically will always look to the idea that the priorities need to be put on the side of individual freedom. And government's power must always be limited. On the other hand, if you are one inclined to believe that man's nature is not evil, that in fact man can do good, then by definition you are much more willing to trust mankind to behave in the ways he should behave. And so consequently, those who look in that direction would be today's liberals, if you will. That basically man's behavior is dictated as much by what he learns as by the DNA with which he is born. And so consequently, man can be trusted. Man will do good. How does all of this relate to our efforts to try to deal with Madison and Jefferson and Hamilton and some of the others during the 18th century? It seems to me that we are confronted, for lack of a better term, with what many people refer to as a conundrum, a contradiction. Because we know that the founders were intent on creating a republic. The founders were committed to the principles of republican government, republicanism. They believed that people's participation in their government was critical. Here's the problem. If you are a believer in republican government, if you believe that people's right to participate in government in the government under which they live, in the rules under which they are expected to live, then by definition, you have to have a certain faith in man's innate goodness. The founders used the term virtue, civic virtue. You had to be able to put aside your own self-interests in deference to the public interest. If you lived in society, then your reason, your common sense would tell you that there have to be certain rules of behavior to govern how people treat each other, how it's possible for people to live together in community. How do you create the kind of political environment where people are encouraged to have respect for each other, to respect each other's rights and liberties? It seems to me that if, and this is, when I say if, I mean this as a given, because this is what the founders believed, including in Madison being one of the leading advocates of this. The founders believed that Republican government demanded the existence of civic virtue. That if people could not be trusted to put the public interest ahead of their own private interests ever, then Republican government could not work. So the implication we are drawn to here is that the very existence of Republican government in America, since it is totally dependent on the existence of civic virtue, must be based on some sort of faith, some sort of belief that human nature is not totally bad. In other words, what I'm suggesting is that there's a basic contradiction between republicanism and Thomas Hobbes, for example. And if republicanism is driven by the public interest, then that means that government's number one priority is to govern in the name of the public interest. Government's job is to look out for everybody, not just the rights and the property of the few, but the rights and liberties of everybody. And thus we have the debates, the basis of the debates that go on in our contemporary world between conservatives and liberals. How powerful must government be? How big must government be in order to ensure that the public interest does not become vulnerable to the influence and the power of private interests? The other side of that coin, how much regulation of people's freedoms and their property is necessary to preserve the public interest? How much is necessary before you begin to infringe on the rights and freedoms of individuals. How do you balance the freedom of people on the one hand and the preservation of order on the other? How do you guarantee that people's freedoms will be preserved? And at the same time, recognize that government's principal responsibility is the public interest, not private interests. If conservative philosophy reigns, if conservatives call the shots, then government's principal job will be to protect the freedom and the wealth and the property of the few. Because we know that in a society in which people are free, some people are going to end up much better off, much wealthier than others. So the question is, what's government's priority job? What's government's principal responsibility? Is it to protect people's freedom to be unequal, to be successful? Or is it to make sure that the individual success of the few is not at the expense of the misery of the many? That balance, maintaining that balance between freedom and order, is the classic challenge, if you will, of the day. It was the challenge that the founders wrestled with. And it seems to me that one of the dangers we find ourselves falling into more and more is to assume that the challenges and the problems that confront us today are somehow new and never happened before. And that consequently we are in a vacuum. Our job is to figure out how to deal with these challenges, how to wrestle with these problems and resolve the controversies that exist as a result of them. But the fact of the matter is, man has struggled with these problems forever. And those who lived before us have a lot to teach us if we will but look, if we will but draw on their experiences, on what they learned from wrestling with these very same issues. However, here's the problem. Too often, our leaders, whether they be on the left or whether they be on the right, whether they be liberal or whether they be conservative, their priority is to use the founders to justify their political pet ideology. If I'm a conservative, then I'm going to use history to prove that what I believe as a conservative is the correct belief. And so consequently, I'm going to go back to the sources, and I'm going to cherry pick the evidence, and I'm going to find every example that I can find which reinforces the idea that what I believe is correct. And I'm going to ignore evidence to the contrary. On the other side of the coin, liberals tend to do the same thing. They will go back to the founders And they will point to the letters and the laws and the speeches which seem to indicate that their ideological preferences and perspective is the correct one. As an example, and I put this on the Facebook post that I put on last evening. Liberals tend to go to Thomas Jefferson because there's a lot in Jefferson which speaks to this issue of innate goodness. There were all sorts of quotations and statements in Jefferson to prove that Jefferson had a tremendous faith in the people, in the people's virtue. Jefferson believed that the best place that society could put its freedoms in order to have those freedoms protected was in the hands of the people themselves, not in the hands of government, not in the hands of the leaders of government, but in the hands of the people themselves. Conservatives, on the other hand, will go to Federalist number 10. Or to Federalist, perhaps the best one, Federalist number 51, where Madison talks about man's nature. Madison points out in Federalist number 51, he says, but what is government itself but the greatest of all reflections on human nature? In other words, what Madison is saying here is that the mere fact that we have to have government tells us all we need to know about man's nature. We need to have government in order to keep man in line. Madison goes on and says, if men were angels, no government would be necessary. If angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary, Madison says. So what's Madison saying here? Man ain't no angel. If man was an angel, we wouldn't even need government. But the mere fact that everybody accepts the reality that we have to have government, we have to have laws, we have to have rules, and there needs to be a power to enforce those rules, that in itself is testimony to man's nature. And then Madison, in number 51, goes into the complexity of trying to set up a government that remains popular, but at the same time can protect people's freedom. Madison says, in framing a government which is to be administered by men over men, the great difficulty lies in this. You must first enable the government to control the governed, and in the next place, oblige it to control itself. A dependence on the people is, no doubt, the primary control on government, but experience has taught mankind the necessity of auxiliary precautions. Unquote. In other words, Madison is saying that when you're setting up a government, you face two challenges. The first one is you got to make sure that government can control the governed. Again, if the governed were all angels, we wouldn't need to worry about this. But the fact of the matter is, we know men are not angels. So consequently, we need government. And you got to make sure that government has the power to control the governed. But then Madison said you also have to make sure that government can control itself. Because government is comprised of men. And men have self-interests. Elected representatives, magistrates, have self-interests. They want things. And when you put them into positions of power, they have access to things that they didn't ordinarily have before they were elected to public office. They have access to opportunities that the average citizen doesn't have. How do you set up your government in a way that that self-interest isn't allowed to dominate your society? How do you set up internal structures, internal rules, in such a way that you enable government to control itself and the people who comprise it, as well as to govern citizens? And even though Madison doesn't say this in number 51, I think it's always there all the time. How do you do these? How do you accomplish these things and at the same time preserve community? How do you create a government that has the power to control the governed? A government that is so structured that internally it can control itself. And at the same time do those two things in a way which will preserve order, in a way which will make certain that people don't feel that they are being left out. Everybody feels like they have value. Everybody feels like, within the political context at least, they are important and equal. Madison's solution to this was, what we need is a government of law. What we need is the prevalence of what the attorneys refer to as the rule of law. Law and respect for law needs to be so powerful that everybody is subject to it, not just the body of the citizens, but everybody. Nobody is above the law. Nobody has the right to believe that when they reach a certain position of power and influence, somehow the laws don't apply to them anymore. I think we can begin to see how complex are the challenges that the founders faced. I would suggest to you that these are the challenges that dominated the Constitutional Convention. The convention was comprised of delegates from most of the states, all but Rhode Island. They were the leaders. They were, in many ways, the elite, if you will, from their states. They were the attorneys and the large planters and the businessmen and the bankers and the landowners. They were the people of influence and wealth and position in America. Their job was to find a way to come up with a constitution, a political system which would address the complex problems that I've struggled here today to try to explain. How do you do what Madison said in Federalist number 51 the Constitution had to do? How do you set up a government that has the power to govern the people, to govern the governed? How do you set up at the same time a government that can control itself? How do you set up a system where the people in it cannot take advantage of the fact that they are in it? And how do you do all of this in a way which preserves a sense of order, a sense of community, where everybody feels like they're included. Nobody feels like they're getting shortchanged. Nobody feels like they're getting the short end of the stick. But at the same time, everybody believes that they are important and that they have rights. They are free people. They are free to participate. They are free to voice their opinions. They have a right to be heard. How do you convince them that they are being heard? That government is listening to them? That government is taking their concerns and their hopes seriously? It seems to me that when you put all of this together, you begin to get a sense of how overwhelmingly monumental the challenge of the Constitutional Convention was. After all the compromises and all the debates, the walkouts, the people who walked out of the convention, after all of this happened, they came up with a document. On the closing day of the convention, on the 17th of September, 1787, Benjamin Franklin, a senior member of the convention, who by this time was in his 80s, made the closing address to the assembled delegates. And he basically said, and I'm paraphrasing here, every one of us in this room would change something in this document. There's something in here we'd prefer not be there. But the fact of the matter is, every one of us had to allow something in order to make sure that something else was left out. Every one of us has been forced to compromise, to deal, to negotiate. If you wanted to get something, you had to give something. And Franklin makes the point that we have been here through the heat of the summer since May, and here we are in the middle of September. And we finally got something. It's a something that none of us believe is perfect. But it's a document that all of us can appreciate is the best good people trying to work together can accomplish. And then Franklin gives the delegates his advice. What we need to do is we need to go back to our respective states, and we need to see our principal job as getting the people to approve this document. This document requires that if it's going to be a constitution, it needs to be fundamental law. We all know from the Declaration of Independence that government derives its power from the consent of the governed. If this Constitution is not ratified by the people of this nation, then we do not have a republic. The people must approve this document. And we all know that if this document is not approved, the future of this nation is in doubt. So Franklin says in direct terms to the delegates, gentlemen, it's this document, it's this Constitution, or chaos, civil war. So your job is to go back and do everything you can to get this document ratified. It ain't perfect. But Article 5 is in there, and there is a procedure in there for amending it. But the key is to get it approved. Get it operate, put it in motion. And then if experience teaches us that certain things need to be changed, we'll change them. And consequently then, that was the context, that was the background for the struggles over ratification in state after state after state. It seems to me that all of it revolves around the conundrum, the contradiction of challenge, if you will, between self-interest and the public interest. How do you create a government which can balance all of these balls at the same time? When Hamilton, joined by John Jay, and then later in the fall of 1787 by James Madison, when these three gentlemen took it upon themselves to write the Federalist Papers, 85 papers, separate essays, addressing the challenges of the convention, the nature of the Constitution, and the internal system of checks and balances created in order to make it possible for government to control itself as well as the governed. The Federalist Papers become, for all practical purposes, one of the most important pieces of American history that exists. There's no question that Federalist number 10 is in many cases considered to be the premier Federalist paper. Because in this document, James Madison sets out to explain how the challenges that confront the convention will be resolved by the Constitution of the United States. How we will deal with the complexities associated with preserving community on the one hand, protecting freedom on the other, and doing it in a way which gives government enough power to do what it is created to do, but at the same time to deny it the power that would enable it to do more than it was intended to do. In other words, to violate the contract, the social contract. Ratification by the states is that contract. Because it's important to remember, ratification is not by the states as entities. Ratification is to be the vote of the people of the states. And Madison was very, very insistent that a major problem with the Confederation was that it had never been ratified by the people. It was approved by state legislatures, but it was not endorsed by the people. Therefore, it did not have the validity and the stamp of law upon it. That's the context. That's the issue. So it seems to me we go all the way back to the initial question of human nature. It's very, very difficult to know what human nature is. What I can say is that I don't think there's anybody that can accurately describe human nature. But I can also claim that everybody believes they can. The one thing that we are consistent on is that everybody believes that what they believe about human nature is the right position. So when we run into contradictions, it seems to me we are forced to deal with those contradictions. When we run into a contradiction between Thomas Jefferson and James Madison over the nature of man, when Madison makes the point that men aren't angels, if they were, we wouldn't need government at all. And then we're confronted with Thomas Jefferson, who is philosophically committed to the idea that government derives its power from the consent of the governed, and that government's purpose is to protect man's inalienable rights to life, liberty, and property. Then it seems to me we are, if we seek to be educated citizens, we are required, it seems to me, to pursue what appears to be a contradiction. If you find a contradiction within the same person, then it seems to me you have to conclude that the person who has the contradiction is struggling with the very same questions. Either that, or you have to conclude that the person involved just basically contradicts themselves all over the place. I would suggest that that's the easy way out. The intelligent way, it seems to me, and the most, ultimately, it seems to me, the most meritorious way, is to pursue the contradictions to their source and try to figure out how the authors resolve the contradictions themselves. When we appreciate the brilliance of the Jeffersons and the Madisons and the Hamiltons, it seems to me we are almost forced to acknowledge that these people are too deep, too well read, and too bright to not know that what they are saying in one place that's different from what they are saying somewhere else is a contradiction. It is naive to assume that they didn't know that. So it seems to me you can be positive about it and say they're struggling with the same questions we have. And the best thing we can do is try to get into and appreciate the context of their struggles and learn how they dealt with the contradictions. Or the easiest way is to just write them off and say they're just politicians. They say whatever people want to hear whenever they want to hear it. I cannot believe the latter. I have to believe the former. With that, I think we have reached the point where we need to get back into Federalist number 10. And we need to spend a little bit of time kind of going over what we did on last Wednesday and then pursuing it for the balance of our program today and probably for tomorrow's program as well, and undoubtedly into Wednesday as well, because it's that important. I urge you to stay with us. We have gone beyond the top of our hour. It's 12 minutes after the hour, 12 minutes after 2 in the East. I'd like to pause for a 5-minute break, and that'll take us to a little bit beyond 15 minutes after the hour. And then we'll spend the balance of our time getting into James Madison and wrestling with the text of what most people believe is one of the most important documents ever written in the history of the United States. You are listening to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. This is Bill O'Brien. I want to urge you to stay with us. We're going to take a short break, and then we'll be right back. Thank you. Thank you, Bob Kincaid. And I was a little bit reluctant to let you know that I was ready to go back because I was enjoying that so much. That was terrific. What a way to kind of pump you up a bit for the second hour. For those of you who've been with us through our entire program today, I want to thank you for staying with us. And if you are just joining us, you have joined in with us at the time when we are about to re-enter James Madison's Federalist number 10. We spent our first hour a little bit beyond that, setting up background, and we did that on Wednesday as well, if you remember. And I do want to at least touch the same bases. A few of the bases we looked at on Wednesday, because I don't want to in any way allow those to fall through the cracks. More specifically, what I'm referring to here are the differences between Hamilton and Madison on how they believed the Constitution ought to address some of the issues we've been talking about. We do have a phone number. We would love to hear from you. If you are inclined to call and raise questions or ask questions or make suggestions or make comments or criticize some of the presentations that I'm making, by all means, we all welcome you and encourage you to do that. Our phone number is area code 304-663-4676. 304-663-4676. My email address, waobrien906@gmail.com. waobrien, OBRIEN 906, all one word, lowercase, @gmail.com. And again, I do encourage you to take a look at the Virtual Center's Facebook page, and I point out that some of the material that I presented in our first hour today is contained in that posting that I put on Facebook just late yesterday, as kind of the background for this, so that people would have some idea as to where we were going and what I believed that our programs this week would be about. I do encourage you. There is a place there for you to comment on the post, and I hope that you will do that. It asks you to like it. And a number of you have indicated that, in previous posts, that you indeed do. But if you would like to elaborate on that and make a comment, I want you to know that I would appreciate hearing from you as well. The point that we were making in the introduction to Federalist number 10 on Wednesday, and I don't want to let this slip through the cracks because it's very important, and that is the difference between Madison and Hamilton in the way they addressed the problem of establishing government on the one hand, a government that would not abuse its rights, its powers, and at the same time a government that had enough power to preserve order. In other words, a government that would not infringe on individual freedom, but at the same time a government that could preserve order and could rule in the name of the public interest. And going back, as I mentioned on Wednesday, if you read the previous paper to Federalist number 10, which obviously is number 9, that one was written by Hamilton. And Hamilton saw the same challenges that Madison did in number 10. The difference is that Hamilton's whole approach in number 9 is that the only way to resolve these contradictions is by creating a government with enough power to dictate its will. In other words, Hamilton's solution to these problems is to preserve Republican government as much as possible, but at the same time to insist that a firm union, the very first 3 words of Federalist number 9, a firm union is the only way that we can bring about the objectives of the Constitution. Madison, on the other hand, opens Federalist number 10, same challenges. And he talks about a well-constructed union. The difference between those two phrases is important, because Hamilton's meaning in the term a firm union suggests that his way of dealing with self-interest, disorder, and all the rest of it in society is with the overall power of government. Madison's approach to the idea of a well-constructed union in number 10 suggests that some sort of internal system of checks and balances is going to be necessary in order to solve the problems of government order on the one hand, government's preserving order on the one hand, but also government's ability to control itself. If you create a government with the power to create order, and you don't concentrate on limiting that power, then you will end up with a government that will abuse it. So Madison's position is a little bit more complicated. The challenge is the same. The title of Federalist number 10 is, quote, "The utility of the Union as a safeguard against domestic faction and insurrection." That subject is continued from Federalist number 9. In other words, Madison's number 10 picks up where Hamilton stopped in Federalist number 9, addressing the same issue, but focusing on different approaches to addressing that issue. And we went through the first portion of Federalist number 10 on Wednesday, so I don't think that we need to spend a lot of time on it, but we do need to review it, because one of the beauties of all the Federalist Papers, and this one probably more particularly than others, is that this document is a document which hangs together. To pull portions of it out of context and assign meanings to what you extract leads one to the danger of changing the context entirely. It's very important to read what Madison says in the context of the whole document. Only then can you understand what Madison is saying, by appreciating the context within which he says it. And so Madison opens, and again, we've been through this, but so we won't dwell on a lot of these things. Madison says, among the numerous advantages promised by a well-constructed union, none deserves to be more accurately developed than its tendency to break and control the violence of faction. So Madison is talking specifically about faction here. He doesn't as yet define it, but he's obviously suggesting that it's not good, that there's a problem to faction. Because he says that one of the among the numerous advantages of a well-constructed union is that a well-constructed union will break and control the violence of faction. So obviously, faction needs to be controlled, because inherent in faction is violence. So somehow, government structure needs to be set up in such a way that it can control popular government's tendency to break and control, to turn into the violence of factions. The friend of popular government, Madison says, never finds himself so much alarmed for their character and fate as when he contemplates their propensity to this dangerous vice. Again, Madison is saying that the friend of popular government, what that means is the people, those who support popular participation in government, republicanism, a republic. Those who are in favor of a republic worry because popular government, by definition, is susceptible to the dangerous vice of faction. He will not fail, therefore, he being the friend of popular governments, he will not fail, therefore, to set a due value on any plan which, without violating the principles to which he is attached, provides a proper cure for it. In other words, because the friend of popular government is a supporter of popular government, he's going to take seriously any plan which will cure the problem of popular government's tendency toward faction, and at the same time not violate the principles of popular government. How do you create a government which remains popular, which continues to allow the people to participate in it, and at the same time avoid the tendency of popular government to slide into the violence of faction? How do you do that? This is what Madison is setting out to address in this particular Federalist paper. Madison goes on. The instability, injustice, and confusion introduced into the public councils have in truth been the mortal diseases under which popular governments have everywhere perished. Translation? Madison is saying that popular governments have always failed because of their tendency toward instability, injustice, and confusion. And these have been the mortal diseases under which popular governments have always failed to survive, as they continue to be the favorite and fruitful topics from which the adversaries to liberty derive their most specious declarations. In other words, those people who are opposed to individual freedom always point to popular government's tendencies toward factions and their inevitable failure. So if we pause for a moment, what have we accomplished in the first few sentences of Federalist number 10? Madison still has not defined faction, but he's told us that one of the major advantages of a well-constructed union is that a well-constructed union will find a way to break and control the violence of factions. He has pointed out that factions are innately violent. He has pointed out that they create instability, injustice, and confusion in the popular councils, in governments, always. He points out that these tendencies toward injustice, confusion, and instability have always caused popular governments to fail. He points out that the enemies of individual freedom have always focused on these tendencies to argue that the only way to avoid failure in government is to not feature the freedoms of citizens. Madison goes on and says, the valuable improvements made by the American constitutions on the popular models, both ancient and modern, cannot certainly be too much admired, but it would be an unwarrantable partiality to contend that they have as effectually obviated the danger on this side as was wished and expected. Madison is making a point here. He is saying is that nobody can discount the fact that the constitutions we've already written in the states, the state constitutions, have gone a long way toward eliminating a lot of these problems. But it would be naive to contend that they have solved the problem. But notice, Madison doesn't say that. He doesn't say it would be naive to assume that these constitutions have been able to solve the problem. Because obviously, if the problem was solved, we wouldn't even be here. We wouldn't need a constitution. I would point out here, because I think this is important, Madison's use of language here. It would be an unwarrantable partiality to contend that they have as effectually obviated the danger on this side. Clearly, this is not written in a way to communicate with the average person, with the poor reader. The use of words like obviate and effectually, an unwarrantable partiality, suggests that Madison is writing on a level here which some people can understand, but which most people will not. I'm using this sentence primarily to make a point which I hope that you will file away and keep in mind, because it's very important. This document clearly is not intended for the mass audience. It's in the newspapers of New York, yes. But who reads the newspapers? Who reads political essays this long? Who reads language with words this long? Who reads language where the use of the passive voice is popular? Among the numerous advantages promised by a well-constructed union, none deserves to be more accurately developed than its tendency to break and control the violence of faction. That's written in the passive voice. Madison could have said, hey guys, if we really want to solve the problems of popular government, the way to do it is set the system up in such a way that the causes of faction can't get a foothold, can't get access to power. Do you think Madison would want to say that in a document which is designed to encourage people to ratify the Constitution of the United States? If he said that, if Madison said to the average people, to the masses, hey, what this Constitution is about is that popular governments have always failed because people have proven that they're incapable of handling their civic responsibilities. So therefore, what we need to do is set up a government that has the power to make sure that people and their interest in their own self-interest is not allowed to bring down this political system, as usually happens in popular governments. In other words, if he was interested in really communicating his thoughts with the vast majority of the people, he wouldn't have written it this way. So obviously, the average person is going to be dissuaded from reading this thing. Or if he does, he's going to plunge along, he's going to read along, and conclude that many of us do as we read. All of us have read things that we find difficult to understand. All you have to do is look at the small print that comes with your credit card bill, which explains the credit policies of the company. And you know that nobody reads those things because nobody can figure out what they're saying. They're written by attorneys for attorneys. But if push comes to shove and it ever comes down to a legal issue in court, you are being held accountable for what's in that language. So all we can do is trust that they're not going to take advantage of the fact that most of us can't or won't read it. Madison is assuming the same thing. The average person is not going to read this. Or even if he does, he's not going to understand it. He's going to look at it and see violence, injustice, confusion, instability, and all these other things, and people are going to say, hell, I don't want a government that's violent and unjust and confused and unstable and all that. So in other words, you're going to come out and say, hell, I'll support this if it's going to fix that. So Madison is killing two birds with one stone here. He's communicating with the people he wants to communicate, and he's selling a bill of goods to the others. Then he goes on and he begins to talk about who's supporting a solution. He said, complaints are everywhere heard from our most considerate and virtuous citizens. Complaints are everywhere heard from our most considerate and virtuous citizens. The best people are complaining. Equally, the friends of public and private faith, and of public and personal liberty, that our governments are too unstable, that the public good is disregarded in the conflicts of rival parties, and that measures are too often decided not according to the rules of justice and the rights of the minor party, but by the superior force of an interested and overbearing majority. That sentence is critically important. Madison is saying that the best people are complaining. And who are these best people? These most considerate and virtuous citizens are equally the friends of public and private faith. And we know that in the 18th century, private faith was your responsibilities to pay your obligations. Private faith was your willingness to pay your acceptance of the responsibility to pay your debts. Public faith is your assuming the right responsibility to pay your taxes. So basically, when Madison said the best people are complaining, he says these people, by the way, are friends of public and private faith. These are people who believe that your taxes need to be paid and your private responsibilities needed to be repaid. And they are also friends of public and personal liberty. These are also people who respect individual freedom. But they also believe that even though you are free, you are not free to violate your responsibilities, your obligations to the state and to other people to whom you owe money. What are these best people complaining about? They are complaining that our governments are too unstable and that the public good is disregarded in the conflicts of rival parties, and that measures are too often decided not according to the rules of justice and the rights of the minor party, but by the superior force of an interested and overbearing majority. Let's work that language over a bit. Governments are too unstable the public good is being disregarded in the conflicts of rival parties. Now, when he's talking about rival parties, what has he just referred to? He's just referred to the fact that the best people are complaining. And these are people that believe in freedom, but also believe in responsibility. So consequently, we can guess, we can't prove yet because we haven't gone far enough, but we can guess that if the public good is being disregarded in the conflicts of rival parties, then the parties involved are the parties who demand that responsibilities be paid and the desire of some people to not pay them. In other words, we can conclude that the rival parties Madison's talking about are the groups who have organized against the payments of debts or against the payments of taxes, as opposed to the people who believe that they should be the number one priority. Not to go back there, but if you think back the last couple of weeks, that what we talked about Greece and the demands of the international creditors that Greece meet its obligations. That's what we're talking about. The rival parties would be the people of Greece on the one hand who owe the money, and the debtors in Germany and in France and other nations to whom the money's owed. So if you take that example and apply it back to Madison's time, these are the rival parties that Madison's talking about. And he's saying that the public good, in other words, what's right, is not being decided according to the rules of justice and the rights of the minor party, but by the superior force of an interested and overbearing majority. So if there are two parties, two rival parties, one made up of debtors who don't want to pay, and the other made up of creditors to whom the money is owed, which do you think is the minority and which do you think is the majority? Obviously, the majority of the poor, the debtor class, if you will, is the majority. The minority is the creditor class. So then one has to go back to the beginning of the sentence. Who are the most considerate and virtuous citizens? These friends of freedoms, but also supporters of people meeting their legitimate obligations. These are the best people. These are, in a minority-majority situation, these are your minorities. And what are these best people, these minorities, complaining about? Governments are not making decisions according to what's right, but they are instead submitting to the demands of an interested and overbearing majority. What Madison is saying, in fact, is that what's wrong with the Confederation period, why we need this Constitution, is because in a political situation where the states are supreme, where the states have all the power, not only that, but the legislatures in the states have all the political power. The governors are weak. The legislatures are strong. Then the setup is such that the majority of the people, the debtors, the poor, are able to get their way with government, are able to put pressures on legislatures to submit to the plight of the poor by passing laws, printing paper money, by postponing debts, by allowing people to pay their debts in installments, by allowing people to use property to pay their debts instead of money. For example, paying off your taxes in cows and pigs and farm animals and all of that. In other words, government is stepping into what ought to be private contractual relationships, business relationships between citizens. And government is sticking its nose in and dictating and changing the terms of the contracts. And the best people are the ones complaining about it, because the best people are the ones to whom the money's owed. So if you read Madison this way, you can begin to see who he's talking to and who he's not talking to. The majority of the people, the ones who are getting their way with government under the Confederation, are not going to go for this Constitution if they understand it. Madison's job is to make sure they don't. Madison goes on and really kind of brings to a conclusion these opening thoughts. However anxiously we may wish that these complaints had no foundation, the evidence of known facts will not permit us to deny that they are in some degree true. Again, Madison is saying, it would be great if we could say, oh, this is just a few people whistling Dixie. But the fact of the matter is, these complaints do have some substance, some foundation. He said, it will be found indeed on a candid review of our situation that some of the distresses under which we labor have been erroneously charged on the operation of our governments. But it will be found at the same time that other causes will not alone account for many of our heaviest misfortunes. And particularly for that prevailing and increasing distrust of public engagements and alarm for private rights which are echoed from one end of the continent to the other. These must be chiefly, if not wholly, effects of the unsteadiness and injustice with which a factious spirit has tainted our public administrations. Translation, Madison is saying, we got a problem, guys. We may wish we could say that these are just a few people from a few places, but the fact of the matter is, these complaints about people avoiding their public obligations and denying private rights, which mean the responsibilities to pay your debts, are being echoed from one end of the continent to the other. And consequently, we have to realize, we have to conclude that these are indications of the effects of the unsteadiness and injustices which always accompany popular governments and have always caused them to fail. So Madison, in his opening paragraph, has laid out the case for the Constitution. By implication, Madison is saying the Constitution of the United States will address these issues. But again, those, the most considerate and virtuous citizens, the minorities, will see this, will hear Madison saying one thing. The majority, the debtors, if they read Madison at all, will hear him saying something quite different. He's talking about injustice, confusion, violence, and all the rest of it. And that's, at the level they read, that's all they're going to pick up on. Madison is communicating with two different groups of people with totally opposite priorities at the same time. Tell me that this document is not brilliant. In fact, every one of the Federalist Papers is written in the same context. It seems to me that we would be remiss if we didn't appreciate just how brilliant this piece of scholarship is. Now, finally, Madison takes on the definition of faction. He says, and you see this quoted everywhere because this is one of the parts of the document that people underline. Because this seems to be substantive information, fact. Madison says, by a faction, I understand a number of citizens, whether amounting to a majority or a minority of the whole, who are united and actuated by some common impulse of passion or of interest, adverse to the rights of other citizens, or to the permanent and aggregate interests of the community. Madison, in this definition of faction, is saying some important things. He is saying that a faction, as he understands it, as he uses the term here, is a number of people, a number of citizens, whether amounting to a majority or a minority of the whole. In other words, a faction is an organized number, a group of citizens. It can be a majority, it can be a minority. That's not what this defines faction. What defines faction is that the group, however big it is, are united and actuated by some common passion, by some common impulse of passion or of interest. These are people whose self-interest is predominant, is their priority. And they have organized with other people who have the same self-interest that they do. And whether we're talking minority or majority, the fact of the matter is that because it's self-interest that drives them, that means that by definition it is adverse to the rights of other citizens and adverse to the permanent and aggregate interests of the community at large. By definition, then, a faction is an interest group. It's a group of people who have organized politically in order to achieve their common self-interest. Even though, because it's their self-interest, it's against the interests of everybody else. Let's draw a few conclusions here. A group of people who have organized around their self-interest. What has Madison already said in this document? He has talked about the complaints being heard from everywhere, from the most virtuous and considerate and virtuous citizens. Now he's saying a faction can either be a majority or the minority. But realistically, which is Madison's problem? Madison has already said that we all would like to think that these complaints have no foundation. But the fact of the matter is we all know that they are true, and we hear it coming from one end of the country to the other. So the best people from everywhere are complaining that majorities are controlling government and therefore getting their way, which violates the minorities' rights. It's keeping them from getting paid. Or it's causing them as taxpayers to not pay their taxes. And government's responsibilities to its creditors mean that it's people paying their taxes that give government the money it needs to pay me. It's credit. I am the bank. I have made loans to government. And government has a responsibility to pay me back. And it's government tax money that's going to provide the revenue that government needs to pay me. So if citizens are refusing to pay their taxes or are paying them in worthless paper money or paying them in installments or making decisions through their legislature that that their taxes don't have to be paid this year for half the year or the whole year or whatever, that's money out of my pocket. So now Madison is saying a faction can either be a majority or a majority of the whole. The key thing is it's an interest group. It's a people who organize around self-interest against the best interests of everybody else, against the best interests of the community. By definition, then, Madison has already told us that even though a faction can either be a majority or a minority, his principal concern is the majority faction, not the minority faction. The complaints which produce the Constitution are from the minority faction. The problem which gives rise to those complaints is coming from the majority faction. Conclusion: what Madison is saying here is that the major goal of the Constitution is to break and control the violence of faction, but more specifically to break or control the violence of the majority faction. Translation: if the Constitution is going to fix the problems of the Confederation, it is going to do so by making it impossible for the majority of the people to ever get power over government again, which means that no longer will they be able to get government to intercede for them in minimizing taxes or in infringing on the obligations of payment of their private debts. People's access to democracy is alive under the Confederation. Our job here in the Constitution is to address and solve that problem. Obviously, that's a problem that Madison cannot allow the majority of the people to understand. If they did, the Constitution of the United States would never be ratified. We have reached the top of our program today. It is 1 minute before 3 in the East. I want to invite you back as we continue our treatment tomorrow of Federalist Number 10. We will avoid the review portion and we will get directly into our document tomorrow. I remind you that we will be beginning 1/2 hour later than we usually do, as we always do on Tuesday. We'll be here 1:30 p.m. in the East, and we'll pick up at Federalist Number 10 where we left off today. This is Bill O'Brien. Have a wonderful evening, and thank you.